Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel with your hosts Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Greetings everybody. Welcome to our Truth Be Told session number 32 today. And we're just plugging along. We've made it into Exodus and meeting here today as always with Mr. Mike Maney, Missoula, Montana.
Oh, it's Mr. now. Thank you.
I got to figure out all these M words, you know, because what was I for a long time? You were Mike Maney, maintenance man of Missoula, Montana.
Maintenance man and missionary of Missoula, Montana.
And manly man.
I think we left that one out, though.
Let me see, what else? Oh, and married man, since my wife and I just, let me see, today is July the 7th, 2021. So just 2 days ago on Monday, July 5th, my wife and I just celebrated our 46th anniversary.
Oh my goodness.
And I know you're a couple of years ahead of us, I think.
Yeah.
You're like 48 or so?
Yeah, this August, yeah.
This August will be 48?
Yeah.
So you're more married than I am.
Oh, wow. On July 5th, I may have written that down. I'm going to write it down now. Wow.
Yeah, many years ago.
Are we any wiser?
What was that? What's that young guy say in the book of Job? Old men are not always wise.
Yeah, that's right.
We've been listening to Job's three friends for forever.
Yeah.
Finally he spoke up. He said, I'm going to take my turn. I've listened to these old guys long enough.
Yeah.
And I've concluded the old men are not always wise.
Not always. No.
So, you know, the Bible talks about gray hairs, wisdom of gray hair, the silver-haired.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily true, is it? I've known a lot of older people that are still just as foolish as
Yeah.
And I hope we get wiser as we get older, but
I hope so.
Length of life does not always translate into greater wisdom, does it?
That's right. Exactly. And what little bit of wisdom between us we're trying to share here on our YouTube channel.
We're doing our best.
We're doing our best.
Yeah. Doing our best. We both are enjoying close to, I think you're in the 90s, and we're going to be around close to 100 degrees today.
Yeah.
So you're trying to copy the weather we have every summer. The Northwest is, I keep reading about this extended heat spell. You know, It's gone longer than just, like my sister lives up around Seattle.
Yeah.
She said they've been like in the 90s, close to 100 quite a bit the last week or two, I think.
We're not used to this, not extended like this.
And you just came from a meeting in Spokane, and they were close to 100, I think.
Yeah, over 100, yeah.
Over 100, and it was outdoors. It wasn't.
Yeah.
You had a tent covering or something, but it was still pretty hot.
It was extremely hot, yeah. In fact, they were trying to film it with their phone on Facebook, and they had problems with the phone overheating.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that's how hot it was.
Was there fire in the pulpit?
Fire in the pulpit. Yeah. Well, there was air from two directions. One from the side with a oscillating fan, and the other from the speaker out straight to the audience.
Well, I was able to watch parts of it.
Yeah.
I listened to your sermon, Time for Everything, Ecclesiastes 3. I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
And I got to see, parts of different, but I could tell that they were having trouble with the recording of it.
Yeah. It kept cutting out. In fact, Sunday, Braden's message was like 14 minutes long because the phone just gave out.
Did he stop his sermon then?
No, I mean that's all that was recorded. It was 14 minutes.
They didn't say you have to stop preaching because the phone gave out.
Right. No. And I understand everyone that I've heard from really enjoyed it. So.
And you're having your meeting in a couple of weeks.
In a couple of weeks, yeah.
Is it 2 weeks?
Yeah, so it's the 23rd, 24th, and 25th. So, hey, we got a new church sign.
Oh, you did?
We finally got our sign mounted on the roof. Yeah.
Did you appoint a sign committee?
Pretty much, yeah, we did. We did.
That's kind of a long-standing joke here.
Uh-huh.
A few friends in church growing up, we appointed ourselves the sign committee, and our motto was we write them and we translate them, meaning spiritual signs.
Oh, we write
decipher them.
Then decipher. Yeah.
So
well, this was a long time project from design to finally getting it mounted was several months. So just in time for our meeting. So it'd be nice.
So about how many people do you?
Now we're not meeting there because the RSVP number count is 70.
70.
Yeah.
That's counting your own group.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's no way we can meet there comfortably. So
that's a good problem, though.
That's a real good problem. Yeah. So the seating capacity of the place we rented is 120. So ample.
Now, is that the place when I was there a few years ago? That community hall or whatever that place was?
No. No. This is. I think it's the Wingate, something like that. Wingate. So they have like a big long ballroom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
you can eat right there and everything?
Yeah.
Oh,
so Sunday a lot of people will have left. And so that'll trim down our number. So we'll have our regular services on Sunday after a number of people have left. So
that's good. Well, we'll pray for a good meeting.
Yeah. And then we'll have games and food and stuff. So we're really looking forward to it. And then 2 new speakers.
Yeah.
That we haven't heard before.
From California.
Yeah.
I'm barely acquainted with both of them.
Barely acquainted. Oh, they're family.
Yeah, they are.
Well, we'll get to know them better.
They're both good men, good pastors, good speakers. You'll enjoy both of them. Them and their wives are very enjoyable just to visit with, besides what they'll do in the pulpit. Yeah.
Well, we hope they have a good experience here, and maybe come back some other time, maybe just family vacation or whatever.
Those 2 would be John Hughes and Nick Winkleman.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're really looking forward to it. And Peter is our coordinator again this year. So he's the contact guy. So yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
And I hope the church is revived as a result. And maybe gain a few new members or something. And
that'd be great.
That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, what you got for us today?
Well, we're trying to jump into the book of Exodus. Of course, our overall theme continues to be the same as it has been through Genesis, as Luke 24, beginning at Moses and all the prophets. He expanded to them in all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. And we're Luke 24:27. And Jesus also said in John 5:35, search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, but these are those that speak of me. Yeah. So the scriptures speak of Christ, and of course at that time, what we call the Old Testament, which is really maybe not the best term to use about the first 39 books of the Bible. I like to call them the pre-apostolic writings, or something like that. Yeah. The Old Testament, New Testament, the idea of New Testament carries such a better idea that I think in many people's minds they tend to downgrade the role of the Old Testament. Yeah. And it's all inspired. It's all important. Yes. It all has themes that are introduced in one of our early sessions when we were in Genesis 1. we talked about this idea of the seeds of Genesis 1. The
Yes.
seed is in itself, after its kind. And we talked about how that many key doctrines are introduced in Genesis 1 and also Genesis 2 and 3, but especially Genesis 1. They're introduced and then they are enlarged upon through the rest of the Bible. And so the seeds are planted and then they produce large trees and fruit and all sorts of wonderful nourishment all the way through the rest of the Bible. When we come to Exodus, that idea still holds true. The book of Exodus being about deliverance from bondage, the redemptive power of God, the promises given, the law of God, the glory of God manifested to them, the wilderness journey, God's protection, and how that God delivers us from our bondage, brings us really, in a sense, into our own wilderness because we are strangers and pilgrims in this world. And we're traveling toward the promised land. And all of the ways that God provides and protects us along the way. And along the way also in that wilderness journey, he tests us. And the problem is we often turn it around, as God said about Israel in Numbers 13, 14, 15, when the spies went into the land and brought back a good and evil report, and they chose to believe the evil report. And he said, "You have tested me these 10 times. So they turned it around and put God to the test when God's purpose was to put them to the test, test their faith. So in essence, they failed the test. That whole generation had to die in the wilderness. And we've seen many, too many, who started out in faith, applied the blood, went through the water, received the law, started that wilderness journey, and then failed in their walk of faith in the wilderness and fell by the wayside.
You know, it's interesting how what you're saying is, so that first all-important generation failed. We're about ready to come full circle, because when Jesus returns, prior to his return will be another generation that will have failed. There'll be a great falling away. And so with all the history behind us now, and the scriptures there, the events that we read about, another generation is going to fail on us. And so
and then Joshua and Caleb, of course, represent what the Bible, another great theme through the Bible, is the elect remnant. There's always going to be a faithful elect remnant. Who are going to make it, who are going to believe the promises and not fall away, and are going to be urging those falling away to not fall away, just like Joshua and Caleb said. We are, there are giants. There are walled cities. There are major obstacles in the eyes of the flesh to overcome. But we are well able. And of course, the other 10 spies, kind of like Satan in the Garden of Eden, it added that one word, you shall not surely die. The 10 spies said, we are not able. So they kind of copied the same approach that the serpent did to Adam and Eve. And the people chose to believe the 10 spies. And the reason they gave, we're getting way ahead of ourselves already on the story, but the reason they gave is it's not so much that these are the men talking, the leaders of their families and the leaders of the tribes, because those 10 spies were leaders of each of their tribes.
They were. They were not just,
They were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were not just, they were second choices. They were first-rate choices to represent their tribes and their families. But then all the men of each tribe, the reason they gave was, it's not us, we're just afraid for our wives and our children. And so God basically told them, you know what? You're going to die, but I'm going to bring your children in. And your children, who you said you were afraid for, are going to be the ones to fight the battles and conquer the land and inherit it. Because your excuse is a phony excuse.
Yes, it is. Yes,
You're hiding behind that as an excuse. And so I'm gonna take what you claim to be your reason for not going in, and I'm gonna bring them in, and you're not gonna go in. So just these kind of major themes, and this major theme of deliverance from bondage and into a wilderness journey to receive the promised land is a recurring theme all through the Bible.
Yes, it is.
And it really began before this, when God brought Abram into the land of promise. And then immediately Abram went down to Egypt. And then we can say that he had his own wilderness time. And then he came back into the land of promise. And that same cycle was then repeated by Jacob's descendants, where they were in the land, and then they left the land to go down into Egypt, and then they had their own wilderness journey, and then they came back into their land. And that same cycle, that same theme, you might say, it was repeated with Jesus himself, wasn't it? Born in the land, in the house of bread in Bethlehem. Left and went to Egypt, and then had kind of his own wilderness journey with his parents back to the promised land. And then even in his ministry, he had that wilderness experience. Right after his baptism, just like the nation of Israel. So these repeated themes, and then Israel is going to have that. It's going to have it again. There's going to be another exile, shorter term during the tribulation, and they're going to go into the wilderness again before they're brought back into their promised land for 1,000 years. So this is a very important theme we're talking about, and Bible writers, Bible commentators, Bible teachers have all noticed this recurring theme. For instance, like the book of Matthew, who is the gospel writer writing most to the Jewish mind, really lays out his book according to this Exodus theme. If you think about it, Matthew 2, he's the only gospel writer who records the death of the babies and the flight of Jesus into Egypt and the return to the promised land from Egypt. And then moving into chapter 3, the idea of coming through the water to start his ministry, and immediately after the water, in chapter 4, enters into a wilderness experience. And just so happens, based on the number 40, 40 days in his case instead of 40 years. But the reason they had 40 years is because it was 40 days for the spies. And so a day for a year. So that same 40-year theme is taken over into the life of Christ. And then Matthew chapter 5, he leaves that wilderness experience and goes up into a mountain to receive and deliver the word of God. We call it the
Sermon on the Mount.
In chapter 5. So in Matthew chapters 2 through 5, you have that whole Exodus cycle is kind of the outline that Matthew uses to lay out that story of the birth and the early ministry of Christ.
Yeah.
And he goes up into the mountain in this long 3-chapter discourse, very much like Moses going up and receiving the word of God and then bringing it back down to the people.
Yeah.
And even the rest of the book of Matthew, many people divide it into what is called 5 major discourses. And you really can kind of divide it into 5 major discourses. Some say more, but the idea is that the rest of the book of Exodus, after he goes up into the mountain to receive the word of God, is basically Moses teaching them what God had taught him up on the mountain. And those discourses in the book of Matthew is basically Jesus expounding to the nation of Israel. He said, I came not to say anything of myself. I'm only going to say what the Father has given me to say. So he's kind of like a Moses figure, and exactly what Moses said, a prophet shall come to you like unto me, and him you shall hear. So Jesus is kind of like a fulfillment of a Moses figure, or Moses was a prefigure of Christ. And it's really shown in the book of Matthew better than anywhere else. So over and over, you have this kind of repetition of this wilderness theme, deliverance from bondage, this wilderness. And I'd like to maybe even expand on it a little bit, because what you and I like to do so much is to look at the large picture. And look at things not just through a microscope, where God dots all the I's and crosses all the T's. I like that part too. But we also like to look at things from a telescope. Where we just look at it from the long range view. And so I was thinking about this when Israel has this short-term future exile again, of what Jeremiah calls the time of Jacob's trouble. And they were in a time of trouble in Egypt, and God delivered them. And in a way, the wilderness experience was not just a test of their faith, but it was part of their deliverance from Egypt and going into the promised land. And the Bible speaks about, let me just turn over to a few scriptures before we get back into the book of Exodus. There in Jeremiah 30, where it talks about the time of Jacob's trouble. In verse 7, alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. Okay, so that idea is repeated several times. Daniel chapter 12, I just sent out a study handout on Daniel chapter 12. I kind of highlighted this, that Jeremiah is Daniel's mentor. And Daniel grew up as a young boy, probably being taught by Jeremiah in the palace of Josiah. They all worked together. And before Daniel was sent off to Babylon, he probably was taught and influenced by Jeremiah, who had already begun his prophetic ministry before Daniel was taken away. And you notice Daniel kind of repeats many of the same phrasing as Jeremiah. And we do know that Jeremiah wrote to the captives in Babylon about their captivity and how long it would last. That's how Daniel knew in Daniel 9 to start praying about it. So that leads me to believe that Daniel may well have written a number of personal correspondences to Daniel. They may have had an ongoing correspondence back and forth.
Between Daniel and Jeremiah.
Between Daniel and Jeremiah, And because, for instance, here, so that none is like it. Well, Daniel 12:1 says, that there's going to be a time of trouble such as there has never been. It's just Daniel's way of saying the same thing as Jeremiah. And where did he get it from? Well, he got it from Jeremiah's writings. It says, it is the time of Jacob's trouble. So, of course, this is the phrase many of our pre-tribulation rapture friends really pick up on. Here it is, written 600 years before the church was even organized. But people say, well, it says it's the time of Jacob's trouble. So it doesn't even mention the church. It's only confined to Jacob, to Israel, not to the church.
Yeah.
Those kind of statements really sound convincing until you think about it. Well, of course he doesn't mention the church.
Yeah.
Came along 600 years later. But the thing I bring up when people say that, I say, well, okay, yeah, it's the time of Jacob's trouble. And you say it can't be for the church because it says it's Jacob's trouble, so it must be confined to him. And I like to ask the follow-up question, so are you saying that the time of Jacob's trouble is not going to be a time of trouble for the rest of the world? If it's only confined to Israel, the rest of the world is off. They're home free, they're hands off. No, it's a time for trouble for the whole world.
Yes. Yeah.
Just because it says Jacob's trouble doesn't mean it cannot extend beyond that. The Great Tribulation is not just confined to Israel.
Yeah.
It affects the whole world.
Well, I've said that the Antichrist goes after the Saturday people and then he turns against the Sunday people.
Which is exactly what Revelation 12:17 says.
Yes.
The remnant of her, the offspring of the woman who keep the commandments of Jesus, follow him and serve him and all that. So it's not hard to understand. For it's a time of Jacob's trouble. But I got to thinking about this part, but he shall be saved out of it. So when has Israel ever been completely saved out of her troubles? So that tells us it's yet future. And how is she going to be saved out of it? Is she going to be saved out of it by rapture? But that's what many people say. That's how the church is going to be saved out of it, is by being saved from it. By a pre-tribulation rapture. But the same idea is said about Israel here. She's going to be saved out of it. But how is she going to be saved out of it? By going through it. Not by being saved from it, as so many people want to say about the church during the tribulation. And even Jesus said in Matthew 24:15 that it's going to be a time of trouble such as the world has never seen. Never been. So they're all borrowing the same language to try to say the same thing. But if you go, so we're introduced to this time of Jacob's trouble, but if we go to chapter 31 of Jeremiah, at that same time, says the Lord, I will be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. And thus says the Lord. Here's just some of these just hidden phrases that it's easy to overlook. But the people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness. Found grace in the wilderness. After or during the time of Jacob's trouble, they're going to find grace in the wilderness. When is that? Well, Revelation 12 and verse 6 says this idea of this wilderness experience that's going to be repeated, this kind of recurring theme all through the Bible. It's going to be experienced again by Israel. It says in Revelation 12 and verse 6, then the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God. A place prepared by God. Now, if I tie that to Jeremiah 31 and 2, I would add, she has a place prepared by God where she will find grace in the wilderness, according to Jeremiah 31:2. How will she find grace in the wilderness? Well, she's going to be protected, for one thing, from slaughter. And it says in Revelation 12:6 that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So I asked the question, how will she find grace in the wilderness? God's not just going to prepare a wilderness place, He's going to prepare somebody to help take care of her. And who is that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've conjectured, and I don't know that it can be proven wrong, maybe it can, that the they in 12:6 who should feed her, whether it means physically or spiritually or both, God is preparing someone to help take care of her for 3.5 years. Is it the same they as in verse 11? And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, did not love their lives to the death. Why is the attention of the Antichrist going to turn against the church saints? Partly because maybe God is preparing us to minister to the remnant of Israel that He plans to protect and spare through that time of Jacob's trouble. I don't know that it's two different groups of people, the they in verse 6 and the they in verse 11. I'm wondering if it's the same people. Because it goes on to say in verse 14, the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness to her place. But we already read in verse 6, it's a place prepared for her by God.
Mm-hmm.
And verse 6 says, where they shall feed her. This one says, she is nourished. I take that to be not just physical nourishment, but spiritual. I really am developing this conclusive idea that during that last 3.5 years, the attention of the church is going to turn by the hand of God to the salvation of Israel that He is protecting in the wilderness, and that we will have ongoing mission efforts, and that somehow it's connected to the ministry of the 2 witnesses back in chapter 11.
Because they're in the same time frame.
Yet, same time frame.
Mm-hmm.
They're given great power.
Mm-hmm.
Part of their purpose is to withstand against the efforts of the Antichrist, to achieve all of his purposes. And only after their purpose is fulfilled, God allows the Antichrist to kill them, but not before.
Yeah.
So for 3.5 years, he cannot destroy them. He may, if it's somehow connected to church saints, those 2 witnesses, then he's going to be able to kill many individuals, but he's not going to be able to wipe them out.
Mm-hmm.
Just like he's going to try to wipe out Israel, but God's going to make sure she's not completely wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
So I see this interweaving in chapter 12 of the church and Israel, where the church is called on to play an active role in the protection, the salvation, the feeding of whatever capacity, physically and spiritually. I really think we will play a role in what will eventually lead to the salvation of them at Christ's return, because these 2 groups are then, in verse 17, of course, the woman, and then the rest of her offspring will keep the commandments of God, have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Well, I don't think that's the first time. Certainly in verse 11, it is the church saints. Verse 17, it is the church saints. So I'm thinking that the church saints are being pictured all the way through in connection to this woman.
Mm.
That we will have a ministry, and she will go into the wilderness, and we will have a mission effort toward her. I want to expand on that just a little bit. Let me see where the verse is I want to go to. Exodus chapter 20, verse 35. Exodus 20 and we start in verse 33. As I live, says the Lord God, surely with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm. So here's this Exodus theme again being worked out, but this is talking about the time of Jacob's trouble. This idea of outstretched arm, we know that the bowls of wrath are closely compared to the 10 plagues in their description. And with fury poured out, there's the bowls of wrath. This Exodus 20, verse 33. I will rule over you. I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you out of the countries where you are scattered with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, and with fury poured out. And I will bring you into the wilderness of the peoples. And look at what it says here at the end of verse 35. And there I will plead my case with you face to face. So in the wilderness, okay, so Jeremiah lays this out in chapter 30 and verse 7, the time of Jacob's trouble. She's going to be saved out of it to some degree. We know it's going to be the 1/3 of Zechariah 13. He's going to take them into the wilderness. Chapter 31 and verse 3 of Jeremiah says that the people who survived the sword are going to be the ones who find grace in the wilderness. And Ezekiel, his ministry at the same time as Jeremiah, says about this, he picks up on this same theme as Jeremiah. And one thing I'm trying to do better as I get older in the ministry is to show the close connection of all these different Bible writers and prophets, how they all searched each other, they studied each other, they copied each other, they learned from each other, they borrowed ideas and phrases from each other. And I think that's what Ezekiel is doing here. In verse 35, I will bring you into the wilderness of the peoples, and there I will plead my case with you face to face. So God's going to have a face-to-face confrontation with Israel in the wilderness during that last 3.5 years. I wonder if this is just simply God's way of saying in Ezekiel the same thing he says in Revelation 12 of I'm going to have some people feed you and nourish you. How is God going to plead with them face to face? Maybe through the church, preaching to them. That during that time, the church will say, here's what's going to happen for the next 3.5 years. And here are the verses. And many of them are from your prophets of the Old Testament. We don't even have to use the New Testament scriptures. We'll show it to you from your own prophets. And here you are in the wilderness, and God has sent us here to speak to you face to face, and we are God's representatives. And however that ties in with the 2 witnesses, with the power that they will have at that time to back it up with miracles and so on and so forth. You put all these together, and I'll just conclude maybe with this thought. It's not too far off base because we're kind of carrying this idea of God's outstretched arm, of the plagues he does in Egypt, bringing them into the wilderness, speaking to them from Mount Sinai, hoping to bring them into the promised land, is really what we're talking about here in a latter day setting. Hosea chapter 2 and verse 14. So Ezekiel said, I'm going to bring you into the wilderness and plead with you face to face. Revelation 12 says, I am going to feed and nourish you in the wilderness by someone whom I'm going to provide for you. And I think that's the church. In Hosea 2, says a little different way. Instead of pleading with you, I will allure you. See, that's romantic language, isn't it?
Mhm. Yeah.
That's marriage engagement language. I will allure you. I will entice you. I will persuade you. Ezekiel said, I will plead with you face to face. John says in Revelation, I will feed you. I will nourish you. These are all just, to me, they're all just kind of synonyms of the same thing. That his attention is going to turn to them in the wilderness, and he's going to use the church to bring that message to them. And it's eventually going to take hold. It's going to take almost their destruction, but the church is almost going to be wiped out too.
Yeah.
I mean, both groups, aren't they?
Yeah.
Are going to be almost overcome by the Antichrist.
Yeah. And I think
preserve a remnant.
I think that's the perspective that they'll have in that moment, is that their God is in a very visible way beginning to move again. Right now he's pretty much kind of silent. But by then, with all that had happened in Jerusalem, 2/3 having been wiped out, the Antichrist having revealed himself, and now here they are tucked away, safe and being provided for. They're going to know. They're going to feel that their God is, as in Exodus with Moses, he's beginning to move in their favor. So
yes.
I think that will help prep their spiritual ears to open up and be excited as to, well, what's happening here? And then, like you said, he's got people on board to explain and to fill in, to connect the dots.
Well, I mean, Paul said in Romans 11 that part of the purpose of bringing the Gentiles into the olive tree is to bring Israel to a place of jealousy.
Yes.
And when Israel in the wilderness sees the risk that the church is taking to bring the message to them and provide for them, they're going to see the church saints being slaughtered right along with the Jewish ethnic people.
Yeah.
And they're going to see the church risking their lives to bring the message to these people. And it's going to cause great jealousy in their hearts that these people that we thought did not like us, because the sad truth of church history is that most people see church history as the history of the Roman Catholic Church, the history of the Protestant Reformation type churches, the state churches, the big controlling churches,
which
not
are
the Anabaptist type churches.
And they're very
and they're anti-Semitic throughout their history.
Yeah.
They didn't think the Jews were worthy of the gospel. They saw the Jews as the enemy. Martin Luther became very strongly anti-Semitic. I have a little book in my library, can't find it right now, where Martin Luther wrote a book about his hatred of the Jews toward the end of his life. At a point, Martin Luther becomes so well respected and so popular as a Bible expositor and a religious leader that he felt like, if I could just gather the Jewish leaders together and explain to them what I have come to learn about the Bible, and maybe we can have a great conversion of the Jews. Well, he brought them together, and they had, just like Jewish rabbis still today, Jewish synagogue leaders still are today, temple leaders, they were able to come up with every reason under the sun with a different interpretation that Martin Luther was offering. And he became so disgusted with them that they could not or would not agree with his views of the Bible, that he became strongly anti-Semitic. Well, what's going to happen during the tribulation is that the Jews are going to see a group of true Christian saints who love them, are willing to risk their lives for them, to bring the gospel message to them, to nourish them, to represent God face to face with them, to allure them, to plead with them in the wilderness. But I think it's really going to have a very humbling effect on them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one reason I'm bringing all this up, and I know some people that will be listening to this are strongly pre-tribulation rapture.
Mhm.
Boy, the more I study this whole subject, for the life of me, why would God remove the church at a time when He wants to use us for the greatest possible good in our history?
Yeah.
To bring the natural branches back to a place where they can be grafted back onto the olive tree.
Yeah.
And here we're rejoicing in some wedding ceremony up in heaven, while the nation of Israel, His elect ethnic people on the earth, are being wiped out almost. They have to flee in the wilderness, and they're celebrating in heaven.
Yeah. In a sense, that's an anti-Semitic.
Well, in a sense, it is.
Mm-hmm.
And my view is just strongly becoming that, as I call it, the church's finest hour, that God's going to use us in ways we never thought possible, to be used as a, they did not love their lives to the death. And the Jews are going to see this. And it's going to, I think it's going to be a lot like Saul on his way to Tarsus. I mean, not Saul of Tarsus on his way to Damascus. When Jesus said, "Why do you kick against the pricks?" What was pricking his heart? So that tells me that that his heart was already under conviction, and he was fighting against it. But what caused that? I think what caused it is he saw the humble spirit in which Stephen died, asking God to forgive them. And I really think that had such a deep effect on Saul. And then the other people that he arrested, that he punished, that he broke up their meetings. He said in one place, "I tried to cause havoc like a wild animal." And I think in most of those cases, those Jewish church saints exhibited a true Christian spirit, unlike his fellow Jewish Pharisaical leaders who were so full of pride and arrogance and hatred and all of that. And he was seeing these Christian Jewish people full of love, full of the Spirit, full of truth, full of humility. And I think all of that was pricking his heart, so that on the road to Damascus, it finally led to his conversion. I think I think the church will be very similar to Stephen, and Israel will be very much like Saul on his way to Damascus. And I think the church will exhibit a spirit of Stephen even in their death, and I think it will be pricking the hearts of ethnic Israel, leading to their conversion. And the clearer this picture becomes in my mind, the further away I am driven from the idea of the church escaping all of that. God has I think just a huge purpose for us during the tribulation.
Well, when you look at the city itself, where the two groups are going to land, as it were, both groups are represented in this city. And I just looked up Revelation, where the gates are represented, or Israel is represented in the gates. And the apostles, / church is represented in the foundation. And so here they're going to be brought together in this city. And so it would be no surprise for God to have brought them together previously during the reign of Antichrist to work together and to collaborate. in this whole thing, leading up to their deliverance when they see Jesus returning in the clouds.
As I like to say, it's more than coincidence.
Yeah.
That Jesus purposely chose 12 Jewish men to be leaders of the first church.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was wanting to show that close tie with his people Israel.
Yeah.
And at the end, he's wanting to show that close tie again as he prepares to bring the natural branches back into their own olive tree.
Yeah.
And he's going to do it by way of those grafted in branches who are going to, I think, once again, have that attitude of the early church to the Jew first, and also to the Greek.
Yeah.
That we're going to have a special mission to Israel, bringing God's message to them that will eventually lead to their conversion at His return.
Yeah.
And but these are, I mean, we're covering large parts of the Bible here.
Yeah.
But we're just really enlarging, and we're just kind of expanding these principles brought to us in the book of Exodus.
Right. Yeah.
This God's desire for redemptive deliverance from His people who are in bondage.
Yeah, and then that pattern you already established is first, pressure, persecution, discomfort, and then deliverance from it or through it. And so we jumped all the way to Revelation just to show that the same principle is applied in the last book as in the first books of the Bible.
So we might call what was taking place, we looked at it last week in the first chapter of Exodus, saw that Pharaoh turned against them and wanted their baby boys killed, and he wanted two midwives to take part in it, and they refused, and God blessed them for their refusal to go along with mass murder against His people.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's just, we might call that the first Holocaust, which it really was.
Yes.
And it was in the process of being brought about, and God, of course, had Moses in mind. And so Pharaoh said at the end of chapter 1, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So to me, this is just a beautiful theme that's being developed, how that Pharaoh came up with this idea to kill the baby boys by casting them into the river. But then we come into the first part of chapter 2 where Moses is born. And it says in verse 2, she saw that he was a beautiful child, which is repeated by Stephen in Acts 7:20 and Hebrews 11:23. So it's not just beautiful in the sense of appearance. They knew that there was something special about this child, that God's hand was on him.
Well, Moses' parents were just following orders. Every firstborn male cast into the river. Oh, well, they did that. They just put him in a basket first.
Well, I mean, okay, let's talk about this for a minute. So Pharaoh's order was to cast the baby boys into the river for their death. Now they cast Moses into the river, and it was for his life.
Yeah.
So the river of death became the river of life for Moses.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, isn't it? How God turned that.
Yeah.
Just the opposite.
Yeah.
And then that river of, that water of death that became the water of life for Moses, then became the water of deliverance of life for the whole nation when they crossed the Red Sea. So God, using that idea of water, whose purpose was death, ended up being life for His people. And that water that was intended to be death for His people by Pharaoh ended up being death for His own people in the Red Sea.
It's the same thing with Noah. The same water was life for him and death for people around him.
Yes. Yes,
And
exactly.
we get to the New Testament, and the water that's life or death is baptism. In baptism, we're saved, our life is saved, our service is saved, and without it, you're condemned.
So let me ask this, because it really doesn't say here. So I kind of like when the Bible doesn't say things about your questions, because then we can conjecture.
Yeah.
We can be free to guess.
Yes, yes.
So, okay, the firstborn, well, it says every son in verse 22. Why was this said after Aaron was born? Because Aaron was older than Moses.
Yeah.
Did the law not start until after Aaron was born? So he escaped, but he was only, what, 3 years older, I think, than Moses. Why wasn't Aaron affected by?
Yeah, I've always thought that this order came in after, without digging into it. I just assumed that it came in later. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, but I guess, so Pharaoh considered himself merciful by saying, I won't kill any young boys that were born just before this.
Yeah.
Only those born after this.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course, certain things were happening all around them. The nation was getting larger. He noticed that, and I think weren't there other people also to the north, the Hyksos people? So they may have posed a threat. There could have been a lot of different dynamics here.
Yeah, the rulership of Egypt had changed several times.
Yeah.
During this general time period.
Yeah.
And some say, here's where history gets kind of blurry. Some say the Hyksos were actually the ones in charge of Egypt during the time of Joseph. And the Hyksos were Semitic peoples like Israel. So that might be one reason why they were more friendly to them. And that when the Hyksos were overthrown, and the older actual Egyptian types who had controlled before came back into rule, that's the Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. But historians kind of disagree as to exactly when the Hyksos ruled and then were overthrown themselves and everything.
Yeah.
But there's some of that makes sense. If the Hyksos would have maybe been friendlier to fellow Semitic peoples.
At any rate, Pharaoh's growing more and more paranoid just at that time in history of all times. Just at the time Moses is born, so it all kind of just converges. His plan just unfolds perfectly.
God raises up a savior figure. Yeah. And it's, we kind of mentioned this with the midwives, but, 5 women, we say 5 women helped Moses when he was helpless. Of course, his mother and his sister here in the first part of chapter 2, they could no longer hide him in verse 3. And the mother and the sister involved in that. And his sister Miriam standing afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh comes along. So you have 2 Hebrew women, his mother and sister, a pagan Pharaoh's daughter, idolatrous, but she was involved in sparing him. And then, of course, whatever earlier the 2 midwives were doing, whether they were Gentiles or Jews, we discussed that a little bit last week. But here in the birth time period of Moses, there were 5 women involved in the sparing of his life. It's just, just women were very important in his early life. And I'm thinking about over there in, I think, Luke Luke 8, is it? Anyway, all through the Gospels, there's just this kind of repeating theme of how important the women were.
Yes.
And that one passage mentions that
Ministered to Jesus.
they provided
Yes.
financial support.
Yes.
You know, the men had to leave their boats
Uh-huh.
and their tax tables and their sources of income.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was either their wives or their mothers or their sisters or just friends of some type, godly
Yeah.
women,
Yeah.
were paying for a lot of their expenses.
Yeah.
So women, at his death, at his burial, at his resurrection, if you just focus on the role of the women in the ministry of Christ, it really becomes pretty surprising what a major role they played.
Yeah.
And it adds to the idea of what a major role women are to play in church life today. At the burial, at the resurrection, women were very prominent in their involvement. And, in the 120 in the upper room, many of them were, of course, women.
Yeah.
So they played a key role in the early church, in the ministry of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good study to just look at it from that standpoint.
I thought of another woman, in fact, Anna.
Oh yeah,
when they brought, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Of course, Martha and Mary they made sure he always had a place to stay when he was in the Jerusalem area.
Yeah.
A hot meal and a warm bed.
Yes. Yes.
Because he had no place to stay.
Right.
And Mary and Martha took care of him.
Yeah.
Mostly Martha. She made sure that there were clean sheets and
right.
and a meal from the stove.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mary, as Jesus said, chose the better part.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it doesn't mean Martha's part was not important.
Yeah.
And I guess we would say the best mix would be of both in a woman in church, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, once Martha calmed down, Mary could teach her the lesson she missed.
We need Marthas and we need Marys. And,
yes. Yeah.
Most women hopefully aspire to be some of both.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, that connection that we're trying to make, we're not trying to cover all the details of these stories, of these chapters, of these events of Genesis and Exodus. We're trying to maintain a connection to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the similarity, is the key role women played in the life of Moses and of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses, of course, raised by Pharaoh's daughter, but the hand of God in all of this, that she recognized that it was a Hebrew baby, and she needed someone to help nurse him and take care of him. And that's when Miriam stepped in at just the right time. Said, I think I know somebody.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so because Hebrews 11 talks about this, the faith of Moses' parents, they were not afraid of the king's commandment. And so they risked their own lives to preserve the life of their son. And as a result of their faith, God blessed their faith.
Yeah.
And the mother of Moses got to be his nursemaid and to be his nanny, to raise him until he was weaned, and got paid for it.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good deal, isn't it?
Yes, a pretty good deal. Yeah.
And so it was, a lot of people miss this part, but he always knew who his mother was. He always knew he was a Hebrew.
Yeah.
His heritage was never hidden from him. Even though he was raised somewhat as Pharaoh's son, he realized that his people were the people of Israel.
Right.
And he was shielded and protected from a lot of the harm that was being brought to them until he came of age and had a certain amount of freedom on his own. And then he went out from all of his training and schooling and palace, all that was going on in the palace. He was able to do some traveling, and he was able to see with his own eyes. somewhat like we're not told much about the first 40 years of Moses' life. We're not really told much about the first 30 years of the life of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Just a few little things.
Yeah.
But it was much like Moses. He was being prepared for what God's call really was in his life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that the unspoken or the hidden years of Jesus were somewhat like the first 40 years of Moses' life. God was preparing him for a call in his life. And of course, for Moses, it was to be a deliverer. For Jesus, it was to be a deliverer. And so Moses ventures out, chapter 2 and verse 11, and he went out to it says he went out to his brethren. And he looked at their burdens. So we suppose that he was hidden from a lot of this during the first 40 years of his training. And some of this must have been a surprise to him. And he sees the whole condition of his people kind of summarized in this one single event: an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And the reality of what was going on a larger scale began to set in.
Yeah.
And so he reacted in a very strong way. Maybe partly out of guilt, we don't know, that maybe he thought he should have known more or done more earlier or something. But the sudden realization of what was happening, this injustice to his people as a whole, as represented in this one single event. So he reacted in a very strong way, and he killed the Egyptian. And he knew when he did it that he was in for trouble.
Yeah.
But he was already acting as a deliverer, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Just in the flesh.
Yes.
The timing wasn't right. The method wasn't right.
Yeah.
So he's a type of Christ, but Christ never made these kind of mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Christ always did exactly the right thing at the right time. So all of these types of Christ break down at some point.
Yeah. There's where the road forks.
So Moses was a great man of God, but he was human, and he understood to some degree that God had chosen him. Maybe his parents had relayed some of what it meant to be a beautiful child, that they felt like God had a purpose in his life.
Yeah.
He was being trained for something obviously very important. But he just didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle put together yet. And so he was trying to do it in his own flesh. And so we see this injustice of an Egyptian beating Hebrew. So he kills the Egyptian. And then the next injustice of two Hebrews at each other. And he tries to step in and be a mediator, be a peacemaker.
Yeah.
And they said in verse 14, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" Well, God did.
Yeah.
God did. That's what Stephen says in Acts 7. He supposed that his brethren should have known. Well, how would they have known?
Right.
So they were being mistreated, and they really didn't understand what God was doing behind the scenes. Moses had a certain amount of comprehension, but not totally. And so in his own mind, I think at this point, when he heard this, he knew that he would be caught, he would be captured, he'd be punished. And so he fled to Midian. And I wonder if in his own mind at this point, he thought he was a failure. He took a shot at it, being the deliverer in his own method, his own time. And I think this is part of maybe why later in chapter 3, when God appeared to him in the burning bush and told him what his true calling was, and that now the timing was right, that may be a part of the reason why Moses tried to get out of it. He drew back.
Mm.
Is that in his mind, I took a shot at it.
Yeah.
I attempted to be the deliverer, and God didn't come to my rescue, and it didn't work out, and it all blew up my face, and I had to run for my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So who's to say I should really do it now? I tried and it failed, and so I'm just going to stay out of it. And God had to let him know that the time is right. I'll give you the method. It'll be right. I'll be with you. I'll show my power. So Moses just kind of jumped the gun a little bit, and it didn't work out. And one thing Moses had yet to learn, he learned a lot those first 40 years. I may have mentioned this before, but the pastor I grew up, Richard Harless, he'd always say about Moses that Moses spent the first 40 years of his life learning he was somebody.
Mm.
And he spent the next 40 years of his life learning he was nobody. And then he spent the last 40 years of his life learning how that God could take a nobody and make somebody out of it. That always stuck with me. I always liked it.
I like that. Yeah.
But first 40 years of his life, he learned a lot that helped him later across the wilderness. He learned a lot about leadership, about administration, about he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and it came into good use later.
Yes.
So it wasn't like it was wasted 40 years.
Yeah.
But he also needed to learn the lessons of the next 40 years. A patient, humble reliance upon God. That it can't be in my own power, my own time, my own method, my own strength. I have to come to the end of my strength.
Yeah.
Like the people, like the nation had to learn.
Yeah.
They were at the end of their own strength when they were delivered.
Yeah.
And that if there's going to be deliverance, it's going to be by the power of God.
I think there's something about this Jewish people that God is constantly stripping the bark off of them. Because the Apostle Peter would go through that, I think I'm somebody, I'm one of the 12, as it were. Then I realized I'm nobody because I failed, and then God had to revisit him on the backside of the lake and restore him. So it's just something about this.
There's something entrenched. The prophets, a lot of the later prophets would talk about this entrenched tendency to backslide. This entrenched pride of just assuming that since they're God's people, that that they have the right to God's blessings. That they are superior in many ways. That they're smarter, they're better, they're wiser, they're richer, whatever, just better in every way. And God is constantly trying to teach them that if you're going to be a light to the Gentiles, like I raised you up to be, it's not going to be in your pride and your own strength. It's going to be in your humility and in my strength.
I was listening to this Jewish fellow. He's not a messianic. He's just a Jewish guy, but more of an Orthodox type. And I think he's got a good perspective. He said that Israel is God's means of proving there's a God. And by that, he means, I think, over their history, all that they have been through in mixing with the Gentile nations is stronger than they are, and the attempt to snuff them out on numerous occasions. And then 2,000 years of diaspora, and then having been brought back. And then once they came back, then 4 or 5 different wars that they shouldn't have won. So he says, if anything, Israel is proof that there is a God. I like that perspective.
Yes. Well, in order for Moses to be a more complete type of Christ, he had to learn what it was to be a loving shepherd. And for 40 years, he talked to a flock of sheep. He was alone a lot.
Yeah.
And he probably gazed up at the night sky a lot and thought
Yeah.
about God and thought about,
Yeah.
you know, I was sure that I was God's chosen one, and
Mhm.
I put myself forward to try to bring it about, and it blew up in my face. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so evidently I messed up to the point God can never use me in that position again.
Uh-huh.
And yet God was teaching him that you are becoming exactly what I'm looking for
Yeah.
before you can become the true Messiah figure to
Yeah.
my people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
valuable lessons he learned during those 40 years
Mhm.
in the desert, in his own personal wilderness experience.
Mhm.
Again, that number 40
Mhm.
connected with that wilderness.
Yes. Yes.
And even then the verse 14 that we read, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Israel still had that same attitude about Jesus, didn't he?
Mhm.
Who do you think you are?
Yeah.
We will not have this man rule over us, except by our own power. You know, when they came and tried to take him by force and make him a king.
Yeah.
And he refused because he knew the condition of their heart.
Uh-huh.
So by the end of the ministry, they were saying, we will not have this man rule over us. Pilate said, what shall I do with your king? And they said, we have no king but Caesar. So they committed national apostasy.
Yeah.
At that point, official apostasy.
Yeah.
Well, what shall I do with him then? Crucify him, crucify him. And they were in essence saying this to Moses. We're going to blow your cover and you're going to be killed. And we want you killed. So the same attitude that started here in Exodus 2 toward Moses was still in them when Jesus came along 1,500 years later. There's a lot of parallels here.
A lot of parallels. Yes. Yes.
And then there's a third injustice when he gets to Midian, and the women were drawing water, and a bunch of shepherds of that area came and drove them away, and Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. Verse 16 and 17. So these are Gentiles having conflict with each other. So maybe one way to look at these three injustices, an Egyptian against a Hebrew, two Hebrews against each other, Gentiles against each other, shows all of the interactions of peoples on the earth, that the purpose of Christ was to bring reconciliation to all the parties on the earth that are hating each other, killing each other, despising each other. The purpose of Christ on the cross was to bring peace between people who had enmity and animosity toward each other, and people who had enmity toward God. Moses was attempting, and really in all three cases, to resolve the conflict in a proper way. And even though it didn't quite work out, he's showing a picture of Christ, of Christ reconciling all sorts of types of problems between people and people with God.
Yes. And in the end, Moses, the type of Christ, Christ wins out over all the nations.
Yes. And then this chapter ends in verse 23. It happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage. Just like we groan because of the bondage of our sins. We groan under the bondage of the world of Egypt. We groan under the bondage of a leader we did not choose, the rulers of this world. And they cried out. And that's what we do. We cry out. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage. And it says in verse 24, God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So whenever we cry out to God from our hearts, whether it be in the first case to experience His salvation and forgiveness of our sins, or all through our Christian life, we cry out to Him because of the bondage of sin, of our flesh, of the world. He hears our cry, and He seeks to deliver us from our bondage. And the term describing that is that He remembered. And that doesn't mean that He had forgotten.
Right.
Yeah. It's the Bible way of saying that when God decides to act, He remembers. And He remembered His covenant. It's not that He'd forgotten the covenant. He just now was at a place where He was going to start acting on their behalf to remove them from their bondage.
And then what He had told Abraham way early on, that all this would transpire, it's a call back to the Abrahamic covenant and those promises. It's just a different time, a different frame of time now.
It's getting time for Him to call His son out of Egypt.
Wow.
Because one reason is the iniquity of the Amorites is just about complete. He wanted, in His mercy, really, He waited till the iniquity of the Canaanites had reached a point where He was completely justified in telling Joshua, I want you to kill every one of them.
Yeah.
Because they have reached the point of no redemption, of no return. And He wanted His people out of the land for that to develop, because as we said before, they were better off in Goshen. Again, this idea of a place prepared. A place prepared for His people, for protection, for nourishment, for all of that, until such a time as He would be justified in wiping out all their enemies, which is exactly the principle that will be true at the return of Christ.
Yes.
He will be justified in wiping out their enemies and bringing them into their covenant promises. So it says that in verse 25, God looked upon the children of Israel, and God, the New King James says, acknowledged them. The Old King James says, had respect to them. But it's the same Hebrew word as when Abraham offered Isaac, Genesis 22:14, when he said, the Lord will provide, Jehovah Jireh. It really means to see. And the idea is that He sees, and then He sees to it. When He sees the need, he takes care of it. And the God who told Abraham that in the fourth generation they'll come out, now it's time to act and get the ball rolling. He had His man who had been prepared for 40 more years in the backside of the desert to be the Christ figure to His people. And yet His people would remain in slavery until He got Moses down there to deliver them, and then they would be set free. So, so people can complain. They can say, well, boy, God was taking His own sweet time. He sent Moses to the desert for 40 more years to prepare him. During that 40 years, His people were suffering as slaves down in Egypt. But, unjust suffering is a fact of life.
Yes, it is.
I would hate to be part of that generation that had to suffer that whole time. But, the Bible says about Christ, the just suffered for the unjust in order that we might be brought to God. And we're glad that He did. We're glad that the Father allowed His Son to be unjustly treated on our behalf.
I think people forget too that God is operating on a self-imposed timeline, that God works with numbers. And so it's no coincidence that these things happen at a certain, when a certain number reaches its climax, 40s or whatever the number might be. God has set forth this major template in which to work with mankind. And so He's just moving along. At the same time, he's multitasking. He's got His eyes on Israel and the Egyptians, but He also has His eye on the Amorites. And so everything, will converge at its proper time as God has already foreseen it. He just waits till it arrives in real time. And then things begin to happen. A pharaoh comes up and starts murdering the baby boys. So things trigger the fight or the mistreatment of the Egyptian to the Hebrew. That popped up out of somewhere, nowhere. But it was time to send Moses out the door into his next phase, his next 40-year phase. And so, it's not a coincidence that these things are happening. No,
it's and Paul understood this idea very well. We have to accept that God knows what he's doing as far as the timing, the method, everything about it. We have to accept that God knows best. So that Paul grabbed hold of this and used this recurring phrase in the New Testament, in due time.
Yes, in due time.
At just the right time. Galatians, in due time, Christ was born.
Yes.
In due time, Romans 5, Christ died for the ungodly.
Yeah.
It was all set according to a time clock that God knew was the best time on that time clock for that event to take place.
Absolutely. Yes.
So we can come along and question God. So you could have saved a lot of suffering. How do we know? God knew that this is the best time to do this. And I know the end from the beginning. I know right from wrong. I know better than anyone.
Yeah.
My ways are not your ways. My timing is not your timing.
Yeah.
You just have to have faith that I know best.
Well, and then some of these things were already cast in stone in terms of prophecy. Psalm 22. And so he has to wait till a nation rises up that incorporates this type of capital punishment. It all fits together so beautifully.
Yeah, the weaving of God's plan is so intricate.
Yes.
That it's easy for us as Monday morning quarterbacks to come along.
Yeah.
He should have handed off instead of throwing a pass. Well,
I know.
What right does the clay have to question the potter?
I know.
So anyway,
another great session. Even though it was 2 parts, it was a great sessions.
Well, I'm leaving it up to you to connect the 2 parts together in a way that will no one will even notice the glitch.
I doubt that. We've already mentioned the glitch.
We'll pick up with the burning bush next time.
Yeah.
And go into his confrontation with Pharaoh and try our best to always stay on this path of tying it into the life and ministry of Christ.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
For the work you do. I couldn't do the part you're doing, that's for sure.
Well, I'm not doing the part you're doing. I'm just sitting here just drinking it in like our viewers, I hope.
Well, I just hope our viewers don't say, you're really missing a lot of important stuff. But you know what? If we do, you just develop your own lessons for your own church and get up and say, I was watching a video and that guy on that video, I can't believe what he missed. Yeah.
Well, let us know when you start your own YouTube channel and we'll tune into it.
Yeah, we want to be able to throw rotten eggs at you.
Yes. Well, you have a great day. Stay cool.
Yeah, I got to get going here, Mike. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Talk to you later.